It was 1992. He was still unpacking boxes when the first call came. "You're going to be sorry you moved in, Jew boy." And then silence as the phone clicked. Later that week, the mail started coming too, pamphlets and racist tracts for the local KKK. It couldn't have taken very long for the new rabbi, Rabbi Weiser, to wonder if he should have brought his family here, his wife, Julie, and their 3 children, to Lincoln, Nebraska. He was the new leader at the South Street Temple, the largest congregation in the area, but the calls just wouldn't stop. They received cards saying nothing more than, "The KKK is watching you, scum." Or, "Heil Hitler, may his memory refresh your soul and give you inspiration." "Your time is up," click. "The Jews will pay penalty for high treason with death by hanging," click. It turns out the Weisers had moved in not far from the Grand Dragon, or leader of the state's Ku Klux Klan. And while they were afraid, they also were fed up, and they needed to do something to help their 3 children be less afraid. They could never get a word in before the caller hung up, so they started to call back. They traced the number before caller ID, and he would leave messages saying things like, "Larry, you better think about all this hatred you're spreading, because one day you're going to have to answer God for all this hatred, and that won't be easy." After seeing Larry on TV, the rabbi learned that the Grand Dragon was young. He was 42, but he had diabetes so badly that he had been double amputated and was going blind. Some messages were more pointed then. "Larry, do you know that the very first laws Hitler's Nazis passed were against people like yourself who had deformities, physical handicaps? Do you realize you would have been among the first to die under Hitler?" Once a week, he started calling back. Until one day, Larry picked up. Jesus has just finished his speeches on the haves and the have-nots. He has declared, as we discussed last week, that the system works in such a way as to condemn those who make too little, that condemns them to an inescapable poverty, and those who make too much to inescapable isolation and fear. The poor are those who will experience the blessings of God, and those who have too much have already received all they can receive. Blessings for the persecuted, woes to the persecutors. It's his observation on how it works, and it would have been fair for those who have little to have taken it as a rallying cry. If God is with us, who can be against us? Let us go and let us take back what is ours. It would have been easy for those who had little to feel themselves vindicated to a point even of violence. "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Woe to those who have much, for you will not see the kingdom of God." So Jesus doesn't stop there. He goes on. He goes from the what to the how. "But," he says, "but I say to you who are listening, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who mistreat you." A broken world cannot be fixed by more violence, only by someone who is willing to change the game. Now, we all know intellectually this is true, right? We've heard Martin Luther King Jr. say it over and over, but it sounds a little bit like a philosophy exercise, doesn't it? Abstract from the world around us, where the concrete reality is that we are the world's largest military spender, almost 50% of our discretionary spending, up 60% since the 80s, to $820 billion in 2023, more than the next 9 countries combined. What does my love have to do with a single person, have to do with that level of violence? What does my love have to do with that level of violence when it is experienced on an individual level? Rabbi Weiser's wife grew uncomfortable with the messages that they were exchanging with the KKK Grand Dragon next door. She made her husband switch to messages of love, There's a lot of love waiting out here for you, Larry. And she made him promise that should he ever get Larry on the phone, he would be nice. Be nice, Rabbi. So when the phone rang and Larry picked up, answering with an expletive, "What the blank do you want?" Weiser responded, "I heard you're disabled. I thought you might need a ride to the grocery." Silence. He didn't hang up, though. He just sort of stammered through a response, "That's nice of you. No, I'm okay. I've got that covered, but don't call here again. That's my business line." Click. Now, after that interaction, the timeline gets a little bit fuzzy, but sometime not too long after that, Rabbi Weiser had his congregation pray for Larry during Friday services. And Larry is clear in his recounting he couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and he turned, and even he recounts he felt his rings burning him, like physically burning him, his KKK rings. And he didn't know what was happening, but he had to take them off because they hurt. But then he would lay there and he hadn't been without them for decades. So he put them back on so he could fall asleep, but then it would happen again. The next night he called the rabbi. "I want to get out, and I don't know how." The rabbi paused for a beat and then two. "Do you want help?" Silence. "I don't know. I don't think so." Not willing to let the moment go, Rabbi Weiser said, "I'm bringing some food over." "I suppose that would be okay." So the rabbi called a friend to let him know where he and his wife were going and told them to call the police if he hadn't checked in by midnight. Before he headed out the door, his wife told him, "You have to bring a gift. That way he'll know you're serious." He could think of nothing except for one small item, which he tucked into his pocket before he headed out. And when he knocked, Larry answered the door with 3 guns in his lap. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. There is nothing easy about what Jesus is saying. And if you're doing it right, it comes with great risk. If you're doing it right, it comes with great risk. I used to think it was wrong to label folks enemies. I wasn't even allowed to use the word hate. Doesn't that just reproduce the divide? But it turns out ignoring them doesn't make the differences go away. It's standard practice in AA and NA to list those with whom you have grievances, to discuss how those grievances impact your life negatively. And then, and this is key, to analyze what your part in this negative relationship is. What is your responsibility? We all have enemies. They might not be as clear as Rabbi and Julie Weiser's, but we do. We all have divides at home, in our families, in friendships that can feel like chasms. And this most current election revealed just how deep some of our divides are, how penetrating the wounds that we have tried to pretend don't exist. And what have we done about it? What have you done about it? I have regularly driven by the neighbor with an enormous Take Back Vermont sign. That slogan originally used in the 90s to signal a lack of support for civil unions and LGBTQ rights. It's next to the Trump sign, and what if his economic fears, of which there are clearly many, what if they have actually morphed into hating me, right? To address it, to address this rift out in the open, proudly displayed, it feels too scary. But is it? He's my neighbor. Or is this what we have going on around us maybe a little too scary? If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Rabbi Michael Weiser reached out his hand to Larry Trapp, Grand Dragon of the KKK, sitting there with 3 guns in his lap. And after a pause, Larry took it and began to cry. And then he took off his rings and said, "I can't wear these anymore. Please just take them away." Weiser held out his hand to receive them, not knowing what they were. But then looking at them, these rings in his hand, he reached into his own pocket and took out what his wife had prompted him to bring. 2 intertwined silver bands, a silver ring known as a brotherhood ring, and gave it to Larry. They talked well into the night, and it was not long after that that Larry resigned his membership in the Klan. He and the Weisers became fast friends. He called and he made amends with every single person he had harassed over the years. It was not a small list. The word in our scriptures today that is translated as credit is charis. It's usually translated as grace in other settings. It's a play on words that's lost here. Over the past 6 weeks, as we have been looking at the way Jesus sees the economy around him and its difference from the kingdom of God, his final instruction on how to bring those two close together is that every time you think the word credit, loaning, borrowing, buying, any time you think of judging whether or not to give someone credit, change that word for grace. If you love those who love you, what grace is that? That's just the way the world works, if you love those who love you. If you do good to those who do good to you, what grace is that? That's simply how the world works. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive payment, what grace is that? You have simply continued to operate within a system that sees in each interaction as zero sum. Nothing changes. Nothing. Your world continues to spin exactly as it always has. But if you do the opposite, if you love your enemies, do good to them, and lend expecting nothing in return, you have fundamentally shifted the way you operate in the world. The little economic engine of your life is spinning against the grain of the world as it is. You turn in harmony instead with the kingdom, as we've been talking about. You form another cog that resists the ethic that would turn all things, including people, into profit. The only true resistance to what we face now as a people, as a country, is love. That is the only true resistance. Now, it turns out Larry had been profoundly abused as a child. Shock, right? He had never known any form of love. He used to go home and hide in his closet from his father. The Klan offered him status if only he could be as nasty as his father was, and it turns out he knew how to do that. The Weisers were the first people to offer him something else, calling every Thursday at 3 with a message of love. Every Thursday at 3. If Larry's wheel was spinning in sync with the hate around him, the hate he grew up knowing, the Weisers put a stick in that spoke until it had to stop. Once a week, their calls interrupted his reality until it finally jammed the wheel and he could move in that direction no more. It was just in time for Larry, friends, because it was a year later when his diabetes took its final turn. He spent that last year giving anti-hate tours regionally and nationally, and then he moved into the Weisers' spare bedroom, and they provided his hospice care. The funeral of the former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan was standing room only. And it was at the synagogue. But I say to you who are listening, love your enemies, not in a remote way, not in an abstract philosophical way, but in the physical, real, small acts of daily life. That is Jesus' economic plan. Do good to those who hate. Bless those who curse. Give without expectation of return, not because it's easy, but because, in the words of Desmond and Mafotutu, in the world of major change, we must all look for the place where the path begins. And it's usually just outside our front door, or sometimes right within. Thanks be to God.